Okay guys, so in this video we are going to walk through some senior React interview questions. So let's get into it. Now, basically, these are of course fairly subjective things because as hopefully I can cover in just a moment, you will see that it's actually a lot harder to test and interview a senior than it is to interview a junior most of the time. And the reason for that is basically that there's very different requirements, and the considerations that you have to make are also fairly different. But basically, before we start, I just want to touch on that because when you're in general interviewing a junior for a position, you are basically trying to figure out whether or not this person has potential and will become productive in a short amount of time with the least amount of training. And when it comes to senior, however, you're actually looking for somebody who is going to basically be able to be self-reliant in a pretty much not necessarily immediately, but in a very short amount of time. You're looking for experience. And I hope that distinction is clear to you, that there's a big difference between looking for potential and looking for experience. These two are very different things. So the following questions that I have here are basically geared towards trying to figure out the level of experience the person applying for this job actually has. And when I talk about experience, I'm not talking about that they have used React for a few years. I'm talking about that they have worked for long enough and picked up the things that are issues and things that you need to consider when you work at various different sizes of projects, because it's not so relevant to have well, it depends of course on your needs, but in my opinion it's not that relevant to count the number of years somebody has been doing something for, because unless they actually have learned and they've taken away learnings from their process of working that are going to be very useful and valuable to the company, there might be other candidates out there. I mean, knowing React is not the challenge. Knowing how to deliver a project in an efficient manner is the challenge, and that's just a thing that React will help you do. What you really want are people who actually understand how React and business requirements and all of these things all fit together, and the things that you need to think about when you are working with large-scale projects. So let's start. The first question is, what tools do you use for your project and why? Now, this is a bit of a sensitive one for a lot of people, because your tools are usually something that some people are actually really religious about their tools. Now, the reason why I have said that Parcel, Next.js, and JS++ are bad answers is not because these tools are bad, but rather because a person who uses these tools have in my world, a very different approach to solving problems than what you're going to need for somebody who's going to work on a larger project. Now, the reason why I mention this is because take Parcel, Next.js, and JS++. Now, these are they are tools that are used in the industry, but they are not the most mainstream things out there. I mean, JS++ is fairly non-existent if you compare it to the popularity of TypeScript. And if you have a person who, although knows the tools, focus primarily on tools that are either fairly unsupported, they may have some popularity, but they are not that relevant, and because if you do that, you actually present risk to the project. And although that might not be a big deal for you if you are hiring people for a small-time agency or you have a very short lifespan on your project, it's a very big risk to have such a person in a senior position where they will likely have a bit of influence on the tool suites that are going to be used within the company, especially for large project, because once you have those tools embedded into your tech stack, it's very hard to get them out from that tech stack. And being a real senior JavaScript developer has to do with more than just understanding a tool. You need to understand the ecosystem. You should have a good understanding of the way that the industry works, especially for JavaScript. And that means knowing what tools are the most relevant, the most well supported, who has the strongest backers, and are a good investment. So this is, of course, I mean, it could be any range of tools here, but good answers would be, say, Webpack, which is extremely well supported. React Router is also basically an industry standard, also extremely well supported. TypeScript, the same thing there. These are very safe, strong bets for a tech stack at large scale. Next.js is still kind of up in the air whether or not that's going to go. Like it has use cases, but it may not be right for your given company. So what you're looking for there is people who are going to mention tools that if you see a trend in that all the tools that they are using are highly niched or highly specialized and not really the sort of tools that you see other large companies using, that's a bit of it's a small warning flag there. So what testing strategy do you use? I mostly do manual testing, or I mostly do TDD. Now, the reason why this is a bit of an odd one is because if you have a person who mostly does manual testing, when that's not a strategy, that is basically just standard development. You are, of course, you're going to somehow do a manual test. I mean, just verifying that the feature actually works before you send it down the stream or push it out into production. That's just common practice. And doing mostly test-driven development is also not really a strategy in of itself, because once you start working with React, you will realize, when you have worked for a while, that doing test-driven development for everything that has to do with React is going to be a lot of that time you're going to invest is quite large. It's going to be very tricky for you to keep productive and do test-driven development 100% when it comes to React components. We'll touch on later on things that may be relevant to this, but basically being an extremist on either side of the fence here is not really that's not a really great thing. You need to have people who have worked for long enough to understand that people don't you can't, it's all but impossible to get everybody on a team or in a company to use test-driven development. It's also not feasible to create large scale applications if all you do is manual testing. And that's, this is not experience talking, or rather this is a person who is speaking from the perspective of, I work as a single individual and I only care about my own process. You don't want that from an experienced software developer. You want somebody who understands what it actually means to deliver software, not to work like an island. So a good one is I use TDD for logic and automated UI testing for the rest. What this indicates is that this person in my world, is that this person has realized that the test-driven development part is a very useful tool to get complicated logic correct. But when it comes to actually validating whether or not the feature works, it's actually much more useful to have automated UI tests for everything else, because writing unit tests for every single thing that has to do with a React component, that's not that useful, because depending on the project setup, you might have mutations that come from CSS could break your component. And that's not something that you're going to capture in your TDD process. You're going to capture that through UI tests. And if you have a manual process for doing that, that's going to be a problem when the project is really, really large, because it's not feasible for a single individual or just a group of people to click through a really big project every single time somebody changes something. However, automating UI tests are going to that's going to be a bigger investment in the beginning of things, but once you have a suite and probably a few reusable test suites for automated UI testing, you can actually produce things much, much quicker, and you don't have to worry so much if you create regressions and stuff of this nature, because TDD will only help you when it comes to logic regressions are very easy to capture with test-driven development, but it's very hard to capture user interaction mistakes or things, CSS mistakes, stuff of this nature, which is a new dimension to doing test-driven development when you work with visual components. Because remember, test-driven development, the original use case for this was for logic. Although you can use it for UI components, there's another dimension of things that you need to test to a UI component. So you're going to be forced to do some type of UI testing. And if somebody knows that and actually knows that it's not going to be sustainable to do that manually, that's an experienced person. How do you handle component reuse? I always try to write generic components. Now, a person who says this is, well, it's very hard to say, because although it is very useful to write generic components, it's also a little bit of it's a hard thing to tell whether or not this is a good thing, because if you always write generic components, you're likely making a lot of you're basically most likely creating a lot of complexity for your project. It's very likely that you are doing more work than you actually need to, because some components are truly generic and some components are actually very specific. And it doesn't make sense to always have the mindset that, hey, I'm going to create a library, an open source project, or something that is reusable every single time you sit down and write something, because you're going to invest a lot of time just trying to figure out how to actually do that. And what's more likely going to happen is that you're going to sit there and you're going to think of all the possible things that can happen in the future, and then all of a sudden you get it into your head that all of these different imaginary feature requirements have gotten into your lap, and now you need to create a super component that can that can be scalable through to like a various amount of feature requests that don't even exist. So you most likely are going to end up with a much more complicated component than what you actually need. So a good answer, I would argue, is I refactor when I see duplication, but some components are generic. Now, this is a pragmatist's mindset. This person has understood that in order for you to create a good abstraction or a good generic thing, you need to see a pattern first. If you don't see a pattern, you're basically just guessing. And guessing can sometimes be the right way to go. Let's say that you are creating typography components. Let's say that you want to have text you want to have a component that styles a piece of text in a certain way. Well, then it's a very reasonable thing that you create the generic component that is called header or H1 or H2, H3, whatever you want to call it, and put some styles into that. Even though you may not need them right now, it's very likely, because these are truly easy cases or very small scoped cases, where a generic component makes a lot of sense. But if you have a really sophisticated, say, component on a page or something like that, if you try to make that generic when there's a single use case for it at that time and you don't even know if it's ever going to be used anywhere else, it's not a good investment to make that a generic thing. It's better to revisit that if you see that you actually need to. So, when do you use server-side rendering and why? I always use it because it speeds up loading time. Well, if you are always using server-side rendering for React, I assume that you either there might be a few follow-up questions here, of course, but I'm assuming that you are using Node on your server primarily, which is kind of interesting because most of the industry at large scale, of course, this is once again, it depends on the candidate and their background, but it's unlikely that you have worked at a range of different size of projects and companies if you always use server-side rendering, because server-side rendering it's a bit of a hassle to actually get that working if you're not working in Node on the backend. And if you're only working on Node in the backend, that might not be a problem, but it's something that is not that common in more seasoned, experienced people. So what I will argue is that I haven't used it because I don't work in Node. And actually, it might sound like a bad answer, but that's actually not a bad answer, because the thing is, with server-side rendering, it has a benefit, but there's also quite a few downsides to it, and it's actually very niche towards one specific tech stack. And having a candidate that hasn't used it isn't actually necessarily a bad thing. It's actually, I would say, I would rather have somebody admit that they haven't used it and admit that they actually have a range of experience from working in other tech stack than having somebody who kind of jumps on the bandwagon and claims that they always use it. Because frankly, even if you are using Node on the server, it's not always a good idea to use server-side rendering. It very much depends on the case. So having, once again, that bad answer is usually the extreme answer, and especially if the answer is very closely tied into what's popular on the internet. I'm not saying that server-side rendering is bad. I'm simply stating that a person who has that mindset is a little bit of a risk. Usually the voice of experience is the person who will either admit that they haven't used it or explain when they use it and why. The extreme answer is usually a bit more dangerous. What tasks do you run and how? Well, I mostly use Webpack loaders. So if you're mostly using Webpack loaders for all your task running, you're going to face a problem, most likely at large scale, and it's likely that you haven't faced this problem because it's very likely that you haven't or maybe you just enjoy working that way, but it's at large scale using loaders for all the things that you do as part of a React build or of a project is going to be fairly unfeasible, and the bundling, like the actual processing time for Webpack, is going to increase to quite a lot of time. This works for like smaller projects, but for large projects this is going to be a lot of hassle. So if somebody says, I tried to use a task runner and Webpack for bundling, if they actually elaborate a little bit and they explain that there are certain tasks that they don't really need to pipe through Webpack and it's better to just fork them off, especially heavy computation tasks, like things that will take a lot of time to run, especially if you're running it continuously. If they explain that they actually make that distinction between things that Webpack should handle and things that can be handled outside of Webpack, that's a good thing. That means that they have actually experience working with a build that is going to have to account for these sorts of things. It doesn't need to mean these things. I mean, once again, everything is subjective and it's very hard to tell, but that would give me a lot of trust in that, okay, if depending on, you know, follow-up questions, and there's always a bit of a discussion when you ask these open questions. But what I'm going for, what I'm trying to figure out, is whether or not the person understands what the problems of having everything in Webpack is going to be, and what you should, like, how to actually think about what Webpack should do and what we can do as a separate thing. Because if you put everything in Webpack, that's going to cause a very big productivity problem when the project gets big enough. When do you use component-based testing, and why? I use Enzyme and I try to test all my components. If you gave me this answer, I would be very, like, I probably applaud you. If a junior said this would be pretty interesting, like, because it's a very naive approach, in my opinion, to approach. It's a naive approach to doing testing in React, because if you're testing every single component and you're doing everything with Enzyme, you're either creating a very generic library of like reusable components, or maybe you are working for a company that, maybe you are working for Facebook, I don't know. If you're using this for every single project, and this is the way that you're a bit of an extremist again, and once again, extremists are rarely the voice of experience, because experience teaches you that reality always hits you. It doesn't matter what the ideal case is, reality always hits you. And reality is that you have deadlines, you have people who are have varying interests in doing like component-based testing and all of this good stuff. So usually it's not a good thing if somebody is an extremist. So a good answer is I use Enzyme, but only for generic components, since I use UI testing mostly. This is a very good answer, because the benefit of having Enzyme and having a really well-tested, well-maintained component, well, think of the cost-value ratio. If you do that for every single component that you make, you're going to slow down your own productivity quite a lot, and there's going to be a lot of maintenance involved in, especially the components that are pretty big and maybe changing over and over and over. And the thing is that you're not so unless your component is something that is used in multiple places all across the project, you don't have so much return on investment from putting a lot of time into writing enzyme tests or component tests for that component. If it's a big page on one of your screens, it's actually much faster for you to do a UI test, because you're going to have the UI test in some manner anyway. So especially if you have some very commonly unused page, say a settings page or something like that, creating super advanced enzyme tests and component tests for that page is going to take a lot of time, and it's going to be a lot of maintenance for you to keep that up to date. But if you can write a UI test that basically goes to the page, just make sure that all of the functionality is the way it should be, that's actually quicker, and it's a lot more efficient in my experience. Do you use TDD, and how? I use TDD as much as I can, and this kind of once again touches on, alright, so you're an extremist. If you are always talking about the ideal case, I will argue that you're either fairly junior or you haven't been faced with the restrictions that a lot of people working in various industries have. And basically, I think that the good answer here is I find it hard to use TDD for components, so I use it for logic. And this touches again on this thing where this discussion that I will have with the candidate is that, all right, so TDD is difficult, why? And if they actually give me good answers as to why it's difficult to do test-driven development for React components, and I will be extremely impressed if they actually make that distinction between, all right, so I have my logic, like I have complicated logic that is very likely to go wrong, that should absolutely be tested properly, and like we should really make sure that that works, because it's so easy to cause regressions when you have complicated logic. However, if they're doing TDD for, I don't know, a button, and if that button is clickable, I mean, that's almost, if you want to be an extremist and like really push for the standard practices of TDD, then being an evangelist, more respect to you. All I can tell you is that most of the experienced developers that I've worked with, they are not evangelists like this. They actually need to get things done, and you do what we call risk assessment. If something is low value and high effort, you don't do it. If it's high value, and even if it's high effort, it depends, but if it's low effort and high value, then you should do it. And testing whether or not a button's click handler is working is not really high value. What state do you put? What state do you put where and why? I always put my state on the store. So if you say that, I will. It's not a big thing. I mean, it makes sense depending on how you look at it, because you also remember, guys, whenever we are talking about this stuff here, you always have to remember that there's a discussion. Like for this little video of mine, I can only say so many things before you get bored of listening to me. We might already have been bored by what I'm saying, but basically I cannot cover all the possible things that somebody can say or how we're going to have a dialogue after this. It's just trying to boil things down into something that's a little bit more digestible for video purposes. But basically, if you say to me that you always put the state on the store, I will be a little bit, it's an okay answer, but I will wonder why, and we will have a discussion, because I think a good answer to this is I only put shared data on the store, because when you're using a store, something like, say, Redux, it's actually not, if you have a form or if you have some internal toggle that shows a modal, there's no real reason, unless there is unless there are other components that need to know what the state of one component is, then there's no real value in putting it on the store. It's actually a bit of a performance, like depending on what you're putting there, it might actually be a performance issue where you might put too much on the store, or it's a kind of a way off thing. So having somebody who understands that sometimes it's actually much easier to just use the internal state, it should be an exception. Or rather, as I said, if you can tell me that you understand that the store is basically shared information and the state is private information, and can give me a good answer to when and why that is a useful distinction to make, that's a very good answer. What's more important, clean code or good enough? And this is a leading question, because people who are less experienced usually, or extremists, a little bit naive, I would also say, will say clean code, because good enough is considered to be it's a bad thing. Well, clean code is always better than good enough, right? Well, no, because once again, we come back to this thing that juniors who are fresh out of school have been drilled with best practices, and they've read all the books where all of the public speakers have told them how to do things and how everything should work, and the veterans, the people who have actually been working for a while, have a more pragmatic mindset, because they understand that, once again, the ideal case is the best thing, but reality always hits you, and in reality you have limitations. So I try to write clean code, but sometimes I need to hack things together. That's the best answer you can give, because it is the truth. The truth is that you should try to write good code whenever you can, but there are times when you can't, and there's no point in fussing about it. You need to just get stuff done, because writing software is not, you're not writing software to prove that you can write clean code. You're writing software for a purpose, and that purpose is to deliver features on time, hopefully in a sustainable manner. So you have to do the best you can with what you have. The following questions will indicate how big the project the candidate has been involved in are. So these are the first ones here are basically more aligned towards just general programming with React and stuff of this nature, but these things are things that are more relevant when you're considering candidates for different, to just kind of figure out how big the projects they have been working on are. And that's actually, in my world, a little bit like it's pretty important, because the considerations that you need to make at small scale are very different from the considerations that you need to make at larger scale. So how do you handle bundling performance? And the best one is, what do you mean? Because if you have never experienced something like, say, Webpack bundling performance issues, then you have very likely either been very good at structuring your configurations, or your project has been fairly small in comparison to the sort of size the bigger projects have. And a good answer here is that there are loaders for it, but I mostly try to reduce the bundling process. And this is I mean, we will have follow-up discussions on this as well, and like ask for concrete examples. What do you mean by reducing the bundling process? But what's good about this is that the person understands that performance becomes an issue when you have a lot of code, and you can't just pipe all the things through something like Webpack. Because if you do, the time it takes you to actually recompile or rebuild or do a production release is going to be quite hefty. And although maybe you're okay with that, if you think about that from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, it's going to reduce the productivity of every single person who touches that code. And over time, the more code you have, it kind of snowballs on you, and the problem just gets worse and worse. So having experience with this and understanding that this is going to be a problem and looking out for the sort of things that can cause this to become even worse is a very good thing. It's actually very common that the performance of Webpack or the cleanliness of your JavaScript code is a big issue in larger companies. How do you handle multiple component variants in the same code base? I try to refactor them into generic components. Again, this is a person who's speaking from the perspective of themselves. It's once again this kind of naive thing that, oh, you have many variants of the same thing and they're kind of similar, but they're not really the same thing. I mean, you come to a place and you see, oh, this is pretty much the same component as this one. I will abstract that, or I will create a generic component. If you do that, once again, you're missing the point. And that the point that I will argue that you are missing is that not everything, just because it's kind of similar, needs to be generic, because there might not be a tight coupling between the two. Like, having a generic component is only valuable if there is actually a very, like, if the two components that are similar actually have a natural fit. If to put it in like layman's terms, if it makes sense to make them into a generic component, that's a great thing. But the most important thing you can do is to actually figure out whether or not this abstraction is a good thing, and that cannot be done alone. And that's why I think a good answer to this is to raise awareness in the company and take action after that. Because if you find, because remember, you're not the only person, in large scale, you are by far not the only person contributing code to that project. And it's very unlikely that you will know every single component that is within the system. So before you even take action, the first thing you should do is to go and ask your coworkers. You should check the Git blame and check who wrote this code, and go and talk to them and see if you can get the feature requirements for this component and understand how that component fits into the rest of the system. Because if you are creating a generic component out of one or several other components without understanding the context of these components, you are already making a mistake. That's just my personal opinion. How do you handle feature toggling? What do you mean by feature toggling? All right, so feature toggling is it's a pretty big concept in large companies, because basically large companies usually have many different stakeholders, and it's extremely common that you have an application that has many different features, and sometimes you want some features to be available and sometimes you don't want those features to be available. That's very uncommon at small projects. It's very unlikely that a freelancer or someone who's working at a very small consultancy has ever had to support like really very customizable features. So if that's their answer, you should be aware of that feature toggling is a pretty common concept at bigger projects. So a good answer is that I use a config file or something similar, and basically what it means is that you will have a file which, depending on your circumstances, you will, or some way anyway, because a very common thing that people will do is that they will check the environment. So okay, so you have a conditional component. Sometimes that component is going to be one thing, and sometimes it's going to be another thing, or sometimes it's not going to be there at all. So usually what you will see in the code is that if environment is equal to customer 1 or customer 2 or customer 3, that is basically you having a feature toggle, but it's also a less sustainable way to have a feature toggle. It's actually much more efficient if you basically have a Boolean value or a variant variable in a big file saying that feature is this feature enabled, yes or no, and then depending on who is going to use the application or who's viewing depending on the context, you will simply use the appropriate configuration file that has the correct configuration. And that's a bigger topic, but usually these are the sorts of considerations you have to make when you're working at projects that have a lot of different stakeholders with different feature needs. How do you avoid component duplication? I write generic components and I put them into Storybook. Now this is, although not a bad answer necessarily, it's using something like Storybook to keep you have a library of components that is very useful. But once again, it's a bit of a naive answer because, once again, always creating a generic component isn't a good idea. And using something like Storybook assumes that everybody who's working at your company cares about Storybook, or that everybody is as involved and as interested in making sure that we avoid component duplication, which once again is the ideal case, but reality always hits you and you will find that you have component duplication. It's almost unavoidable over time. You may not have it within your own team, and you mightn't be very good at a smaller project to keep things in line, but once you have enough components, it becomes almost impossible to track everything. And Storybook is once again something that is it's just a documentation tool in this sense. Like, it can do a lot of other stuff as well, but for all intents and purposes, it's something that needs to be maintained, and that comes back to personal interest. Maybe you and your closest team members or your closest friends at the company will keep this up to date and make sure that you follow that, but there's most likely always going to be one or more people contributing code who don't really care so much and are not as interested, which means that this is something that you need to maintain. So the really pragmatic answer is this: it is hard to solve. It's hard to solve this, so I talk to the teams and I use good names. And this is a person who has understood this, that when you work in large companies or at bigger projects and you have multiple people and you may have people quitting and new people joining and stuff, the reality always hits you. It's always, you're going to find like some type of duplication somewhere. So actually having just making sure that you inform people continuously, because this is an ongoing process. Once again, it's something that you need to inform people about, and you raise awareness and things of this nature. So you just keep things in people's heads so that they are aware about these things. And using good names for your components, like specific, like not generic names, but specific names that like really describe which context and which component within that context this is representing. It makes things very searchable. So if you are on like product page, then saying product page button is better than saying button, because it's easier to understand and find, okay, I'm on the product page. Are there any standard components for this specific page that I need, or things of this nature? So trying to use good names and scoping the components to like different areas of the code is a very good way to make sure that people can find your different already existing components, because remember, you don't have the entire system in your head, so it's vital that it's easy for you to find components unless you want to if you want people to avoid creating a new component that does the same thing. So how do you handle A/B testing? And this is also a good one, where most people who haven't worked with larger projects will say, oh, what do you mean by A/B testing? So A/B testing is basically, it's pretty common at larger scale, where you will have stakeholders, they want to check if a new version of a component or some change to a component is going to create a better user experience, a better conversion rate, or something of that nature. And that means that you basically, what you do is that you create a component that is going to sometimes be shown to some users and sometimes it's going to be shown to other users. So sometimes it's going to be there, sometimes it's not going to be there. So a good answer here is I create a temporary component in isolation, because the thing is that if you go in and you create a A/B test and the new component that you create is basically if it's part of the rest of the main code base, that may not be an issue, but it's very often that you will find that an A/B test has, well, it's one of the two. So either the new component is going to be a better fit for the project than the old component, and then you will keep that component, but there's also the chance that that component will not be kept. And that means that when you're trying out something new, it makes sense that you isolate that to begin with, because it's likely that you may throw that code away. Because remember, it's just a test. It's not something that you need to have a person who understands that, oh, this is something that we should put together, make it work to see if it works, and if it really works, then we will make a proper implementation, versus having somebody who treats it as just another feature request. Because if you do, it's likely that you're going to do a lot of extra work and then you're still going to have to throw something away. So it's a good discussion to have there, to have a little bit of talk about how people think about A/B testing. How do you handle branding and themes? I use Material UI themes. Now, this is kind of in line with the previous things we've talked about. If the way that you solve a problem for a company that is more generic than a given like one library, then you most likely don't have much experience with it. Saying that I use Material UI themes to solve a theming problem is the same thing as saying that, oh, are you like, because you're going to come in day one and somebody's going to ask you, can you solve this theming problem? And then you realize that, hey, this entire code base is written just using vanilla CSS and React. There's no Material UI. Is your first opinion as a senior developer going to be that, oh, we should migrate the entire code base to Material UI? No, it's not going to be, because it's not going to be feasible to do that. So that means that unless you know how to solve this problem in a few different ways, you have most likely not worked with this problem before. I try to avoid them. I use a variant prop in the component. And these are good answers, because if you can, you should avoid branding and theming, because it creates for the company, it creates a lot of overhead process. The designers need to account for many different variants of the same layouts. Testing goes up as well exponentially, because every time you have a theme, that means that you have to test each variant of that theme to make sure that everything works. And it's a big hassle just in general from a maintenance perspective to have themes. But if you do have them, it is a very good practice to have the variant approach, which is very common in the main CSS libraries, and Material UI actually does have examples of this. If you look at their button components, that's a very good approach to doing it, where you simply put in an enumeration or a string or something represents the variant that you actually want this component to be in, and then the component internally actually can figure out which styles to apply and which component and so forth. That's a fairly scalable, sustainable way to do this, and it's been very common practice as I said, in CSS frameworks for a very long time. There are other ways to solve this as well, but it's a good answer. There are other good answers as well, but we can't cover all of the possible things that somebody can say. How do you handle translations? This is also a nice one, I think. I have never worked with them, or we use translation files. So translations is by far one of the apps. It's probably the biggest impact you can introduce to a scaling company, and it is one of the biggest bottlenecks in your development process. So if you have somebody, maybe you don't care, depending on your company, maybe this doesn't matter, but for a larger international company, it's very useful to hire people who have experience doing this, because there's a lot of things that you need to think about when you work for an international company. And this, using translation files, the reason why this isn't a great idea is because using translation files means that the people who are actually going to do the translations have no way of actually using the running application as a reference point. It also requires developer time to use translation files, or well, it does, depending on your situation, of course. It's not always a bad idea to use translation files, But at the very least, you should try to figure out what the process has been around the actual doing of how this person is used to actually working with translations, and whether or not they like that approach, or if there was something that they saw that could have been improved. Because an example of a good answer here is that they use an external tool. The reason why this is a good example of how, and hopefully you get a little bit of an elaboration on this, is because if you can have an external tool that actually stores and allows people to add and remove translations to the running application, it becomes very easy for translators to go in, change translation, have the context, they can see the application, they can change the translation, refresh the page, and now there's a new text there. Designers can change the print if they wanted to, and so forth and so forth. It means that developers can work autonomously from the people actually doing the translations, and you can actually, if something goes wrong, when things are actually out there running in production, you can, in a matter of seconds, go in and actually change it if you needed to. So that's like an entire video in of itself to talk about all the different considerations you should have when handling translations. But if you can get a good answer from a candidate who has experience of this, it's very useful for an international product. So obviously you have to remember that these are, of course, subjective topics, but they're the sort of things that I have spoken to people about, and I know are fairly relevant for people with more experience working with React at varying degrees of projects. And yeah, that's about it. I hope you have a great day.